What's going on, everybody, and welcome to Post Mortem, a Spoilercast series here on Red Tooth Games. I'm one of your hosts, Neil Rivera, and I'm joined alongside the beautiful Wesley Rivera. What's going on, Wes?
Nothing much. Enjoying Spider-Man and enjoying our first Spoilercast here.
Absolutely. This is our Spoilercast series. Of course, you can find us at Red Tooth Games on Facebook at facebook.com/redtoothgames, on Twitter at redtoothgames, and on YouTube as well. We're also online at www.redtoothgames.com. But enough about that, Wesley. As you alluded to before, we are here to talk Spider-Man and spoil all the good story, spoilery bits about it.
I'm excited and I'm ready to jump in.
Yep, for those of you who have not played through Spider-Man, the structure of the show is going to go like this. We're going to talk about our general impressions of the games, what we liked, what we didn't like. We will give you a clear sign when we're going to start diving into spoiler territory. So if you don't want the general plot ruined for you, you'll be able to tune out at that point and then come back in once you've completed the game. So Wes, I'm going to start off with you. What did you think about Spider-Man?
I think this Spider-Man game is something that doesn't happen very often. Every now and then we get not just any sort of game, we get a superhero game. We get a superhero game where at no point do you not feel like you are living in the action. You are you are Spider-Man. And at no point did I feel like, oh no, I'm just a guy who's playing the game. No, I'm swinging around New York. I'm stopping these muggers. I'm doing all this stuff. And it was and still is an incredible experience for me.
Yeah, the game does a fantastic job, and I can't quite put my finger on it, but you kind of alluded to it where it does a great job of making you feel like you're Spider-Man. And it has to do with, I would imagine, the camera and how you get that rush when you're swinging, and just the way it's a very cinematic camera. It does a fantastic job, like you said, of putting you right there in the action and keeping everything very personal and intimate. I straight up think it's the best form of Spider-Man related media. So books, games, maybe I won't say comics, but definitely books, games, and movies. I think it's better than any of the Marvel Spider-Man movies, Sam Raimi, Mark Webb, or whoever directed Homecoming. I can't remember, but I think it's the best portrayal of Peter Parker. I think it's the best portrayal of any of the villains. And I really think that, combined with a really well done story and phenomenal gameplay and phenomenal action set pieces, makes it probably one of the best superhero related games.
A lot of people on the internet have been talking about this or God of War, which is the best, which is the better one, because obviously God of War is definitely the game of the year, talk. And so now people are saying, oh, well, now it's Spider-Man. Where are you on that right now?
This is one I've gone back and forth with. Right now, I think God of War edges Spider-Man out just because God of War is just so polished. And that's not to say that Spider-Man isn't polished by any means, but there were some immersion-breaking moments where, I got caught on a fire escape or something like that, or, had an enemy that kind of bugged out and was glitching through a part of the environment. God of War felt like there's nothing that broke the immersion for me. That and the moment-to-moment gameplay of throwing the axe and recalling it. Not to say that it's better than swinging, but it was so unlike anything I had ever played before. So I think just for that, I'd give it the nod over Spider-Man. That being said, I think Spider-Man, in terms of narrative, storytelling, and characters, definitely is better than God of War. So it just really depends on what you like. For me, it was God of War just being a more polished experience. That being said, it's we're only in September. We have 3 more months before I have to come up with a game of the year, so my opinion could change before then. But Wes, we're going to go ahead and jump into the spoilery bits right now. So once again, if you haven't played through Spider-Man and you don't want any of this stuff spoiled for you, please leave. This is being recorded, so feel free to come back once you've completed the game. But from this moment on, spoilers ahead, so you've been warned. Wes, Peter Parker is Spider-Man. You heard it here first. Wes, let's talk about the main villain, I would argue, Dr. Octavius, Dr. Octopus. What did you think of his character development and how he was eventually introduced as the quote-unquote main villain of the game?
Well, so if you remember, maybe back at E3, they showed the raft, sequence, and you see this mysterious sixth villain for the Sinister Six, and we spent a long time like, oh, who the heck is it? We saw like the yellow lights, which, if you noticed, they took that away in the final product.
Yes. Your audio kind of cut out there, Wes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I think the yellow light was there to distract us during E3, but just going to the fact of once you start playing and you see like, oh, I'm working with Dr. Octavius, it was just like that for me. Like, oh, so Dr. Octopus is going to be the big bad villain, which Spider-Man 2 aside, and the movies aside, even like in comics and TV shows recently, Dr. Octopus has sort of taken a step back as like the big bad villain because, before Green Goblin and before Venom and stuff, like Dr. Octopus was hands down like the biggest foe of Spider-Man.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I consider him still, and granted, I'm not as invested in the comics. The majority of my Spider-Man fandom came from the animated TV series and the movies and, of course, the games. So I've always considered Doc Ock in like the upper pantheon of Spider-Man villains. That being said, it's weird because we talked about this. I didn't think that they were going to introduce Dr. Octopus, and obviously very early on in the game they reveal, hey, you're working with Otto Octavius, and you see that he's experimenting on a neural interface for prosthetic limbs, and so it's definitely setting that part up. I definitely thought it was more of okay, we're setting this up and we're going to end and we're going to set up Spider-Man 2 and he'll be the main villain there. But for him to go from being a friend, a colleague and a coworker to an enemy, it made for a much more emotional story than I was expecting.
And it's a classic Peter Parker Spider-Man moment where you're working with someone who is your friend, and then you help them essentially turn into the bad guy.
Yes.
Against, not his intention, of course. One of the moments, or one of the aspects of the game that I'm slightly upset about involving Dr. Octavius is I did all of the side projects, working on the prosthetics. And so I'm thinking to myself in my head, because I assumed you'd be fighting Dr. Octopus. So I was like, wait, if I work on these side projects and I make the prosthetics better and, I help him, is that going to make him a harder boss to fight? Or will it make it easier? And so, I was so excited.
Yeah, I think you're overthinking it a little bit, but
as a concept, that would have been incredible. And this whole time, I'm like, all right, there's no way that they're not gonna throw some kind of thing. If you complete all of this, or you don't, there should be something like, oh, well, he's harder to fight, or oh, he's easier to fight because all the specs.
Yeah, I like what you touched on there with, and the theme kind of permeates throughout the game, both with Dr. Octopus and when we'll get to him later, Mr. Negative, that it's a recurring theme in the Spider-Man universe that Peter is close. He's often close to the people that are often his biggest enemies. You see it with Dr. Octavius. You see it with the Green Goblin and Norman and Harry Osborn. You see it with Mr. Negative, and in this case, Norman Lee being so close to him and Aunt May. Before we move on, Wes, what did you think about the Sinister Six? How did you feel about A, how they were portrayed, and B, the subplot of Dr. Octopus, Otto Octavius, bringing them together?
It was good to see the Sinister Six. Just all throughout various media, it's good to see the rogue gallery of Spider-Man. Yes, a lot of superheroes have their own gallery of rogues, but hands down, Spider-Man's is the most unique and, quite frankly, the most deadliest. You know, the deadliest.
Yeah, I felt like they kind of built, you know, I mean, with the trailer at E3 being the reveal for the Sinister Six, or at least alluding to the fact that they were going to do the Sinister Six, I felt like so little of the game focused on them. And I would have been more excited had they've been more of a factor throughout the game. Now, I understand that you have to build up Otto as a character, you have to turn him into a villain, but it would have been nice to see the Scorpion, see Electro, see Rhino before just this big breakout scene where, you know, Otto's revealed as the main villain.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I'm glad that they didn't do is a lot of Spider-Man games have a history of, okay, you're fighting the Rhino for the next bit of the game, but like, you know, somehow Rhino has his own like army of henchmen.
Yeah.
And like the, you know, these are not trying to
that's actually when you hit on that, that's actually the one thing that kind of justifies the game in my eyes, where, well, yeah, if Scorpion was more of a factor in the story in the early goings, what am I fighting Scorpion's henchmen? Like, I mean, it makes sense within how they frame the story of, okay, yeah, these thugs I'm beating up on are from the Kingpin, which we introduced early on in the game. And then eventually the demons that are introduced by Martin Lee, and then eventually the Sable International folks and the prisoners. So I think, yeah, you make a very good point that if I'm fighting off against the Sinister Six throughout the game, it kind of makes the thug encounters feel pointless within the realm of the story.
Yeah, and I don't want to fight off against the Rhino 8 different times. I'm like, all right, okay, he's down, I've got him, but like somehow, like, oh, I got to fight him 4 more times for some reason. I mean, yeah, it was not as satisfying as it could have been, but realistically, that was the best approach to go with in my mind.
Right, and I think the biggest complaint anyone can have about this game is that they want more, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just one of those things where, man, yeah, if I could have had a couple more fights with Scorpion and Electro and Rhino, it would have been great. That being said, the ones that we did get were fantastic. I'm not trying to take away from the game at all.
You know, with a second game, hopefully they can do the reverse of every, you know, like Spider-Man 3 and Amazing Spider-Man 2, where they have too many villains. We just need to get more villains.
Right, and I think that was they had the opposite problem here. They nailed the multiple villain thing. No one villain overstayed their welcome. They did a good job balancing that, as opposed to the movies, which, granted, games, you have 20 hours to tell a story as opposed to 2.5 hours for a film, so games kind of inherently have that advantage.
Very true.
Moving on to another villain that played a prominent role was Mr. Negative. Now, Wesley, I'm probably one of many people who played this game who actually doesn't know a whole lot about Mr. Negative. How much do you know about him?
I'm not too far from you. Mr. Negative, he's fairly new. I would say mid 2000s he was introduced, you know, so he's not exactly new. Back when Venom was at his height, he was just starting out. And so hopefully after this, I feel like Mr. Negative's going to make his big break.
Yeah, no, and it's definitely been interesting. I definitely like the fact that they went to a lesser known villain as opposed to the tried and true. Now, granted, the fact that you have Doc Ock to bring everybody together, plus some of the older mainstays, helps. But I was originally kind of put off by the fact that they dedicated so much time to him, but by the end of it, I was kind of pleased with how it ended up. How did you feel about Mr. Negative's story arc? How did you feel about Martin Lee as a character? How did you feel about how his story was uncovered as the story progressed?
it's heart it was very emotional. It was heartbreaking because you see Martin Lee in the working in the Feast Center. He's a billionaire. He's sort of the he's not Tony Stark rich, but he's certainly he's making business deals. But so he's spending so much time in the community helping people, and you see like, wow, this is a really great and positive person. He has not to play on words here, but then you see this complete polar opposite of being Mr. Negative, and you see like, okay, he had some horrific stuff, but he's definitely doing worse than what was done to him. And so it's sort of it's a tragic but classic Spider-Man tale.
Did you think that his story was compelling all the way through?
There was a certain point where I think a little bit after you discover Martin Lee is Mr. Negative, that he kind of goes underground, and you're sort of trying to find him, and he leaves the note for May. That sort of stuff didn't seem as compelling to me, but when I look back on it, it's like, oh, he's sort of fighting his inner selves. Like he cares about May Parker, so like oh no, you are an important part of my life. You run this center with me, so like it's sort of, they didn't focus on the fact of like, oh, is there still good in him, because they talk about that with Dr. Octopus, when clearly you have an actual villain who is personified to be good and evil all at once. Like, oh well, where's the good in him still? Peter Parker didn't really touch on that. It kind of, and this is kind of another one of those minor gripe things that I have, is that I feel like a lot of the narrative is so back heavy. And what I mean by that is I feel like the majority of Mr. Negative's story, up until the big reveal that he's a failed experiment of Norman Osborn's, he kind of felt like he was just there as a villain. I kind of felt like, and what further complicated it was that they already had revealed him to be the villain in the E3 trailer, in the year before's E3 trailer. Yep. And they also revealed his identity. So you already knew Peter had a close personal relationship with Martin Lee. You already knew that he had, the Mr. Negative powers and things like that. So it just made the bulk of his main story feel like, okay, so when's the reveal? Like, when's he, and even when he became the villain, it was like, okay, duh, like, he's the bad guy. But then it really hits its stride towards the end when you realize, in that scene where you're playing as Mary Jane, you realize that he's actually a failed experiment of Norman Osborn's. And I think from there he becomes a whole lot more relatable as a villain. Because up until then, he kind of felt like he was a bad guy just for the sake of being bad. I'll get you, Norman Osborn. Why?
Right. And so then it definitely, I think they kind of kept it, like they kind of kept alluding to something more, a bigger twist, and I think right before it became more of a hindrance to the story, they revealed it, and then it actually ended up paying off in the end.
It was very rewarding in the end, but there was a bit, like I said, just midway where it was just sort of just got a little, but I'm glad that I stuck through it, and it was a very satisfying reward.
Right. And one thing, I guess we kind of already touched on Peter's relationship with his allies and his enemies, more so his enemies. But one thing I kind of want to address before we move on is how his relationship to Dr. Octopus started, and how they built it as this very close personal relationship, because the payoff was just huge at the end. I think that final sequence after the final battle was incredible, where he's they're yelling at each other. Otto reveals that he knows that Peter is Spider-Man, and I think had they not spent time developing Otto as this kind of secondary character beforehand, it wouldn't have been as impactful.
One of the things I've been sort of mulling about in my head is, how long did he know? Because that, he basically, he says like, I knew, but thinking back on this, the scene where, you're trying to repair your original suit, and Octavius just walks in.
Yes.
And when you hear him say, like, oh, you're his suit repairer, it clearly sounds like he's just sort of trying to, like, he clearly already knew and he just accidentally walked in, and he's just like, oh, I need to somehow make sure that he knows that I don't know.
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder, how long did he have these nefarious plans? Because he'd been working on the prosthetics, the neural interface. He'd been working on it for a very long time. And that's apparently what corrupted him. That's what made him kind of break. But so how long ago did it happen? They don't really say. You see different scenes where he has his ups and downs, but it makes him a far more potentially sinister villain the longer you think of how long he knew.
Yeah, no, and I definitely agree with you that the revelation that he finds Peter working on the suit is definitely when he quote unquote knows. I just actually replayed that bit either earlier today or late last night because I was going back through and recording footage for the video. And it definitely becomes apparent now, like, oh yeah, like he knew the entire game for sure. And yeah, you kind of alluded to the fact that he had been working on the neural interface for a while, and you kind of get the vibe that he kind of was always doing stuff behind the scenes, and it would have been nice to see more breaking points potentially, because all we really got from our perspective was Norman taking away their grant and the second failed attempt at doing the neural interface when he went too far, so to speak, and which was the final breaking point. So if you kind of started, I feel like if we had started to see more of it bubbling, it would have been nice. But then again, there's only so much you can do within that 20-hour story.
Yeah, you're right.
But moving on from the villains, I want to talk about Peter's allies, specifically one of the allies that they introduced in this game, and that's Miles Morales. He, like, for those of you that don't know, Miles Morales is kind of a newer character in the Spider-Man universe who gets bitten by a radioactive spider, gets the spider powers, and eventually takes up the mantle for Peter Parker after he dies. Does he die in the comics?
He dies so this is in the Ultimate Universe. He dies saving Aunt May, I believe, from the Green Goblin.
Okay.
I don't know who, but so he actually, he's happy with this death because, Aunt May is like, oh, let me call an ambulance. He's like, no, I couldn't save Uncle Ben, but I got to save you. And then he dies. And it gets to the point that he even, when he starts going around, he gets Aunt May's blessing by giving him Pete's old web shooters. It's a very, it's an emotional origin story.
Right. And that's cool. And I wish, I haven't read the comic book, so I haven't had as much exposure to him, but I've definitely heard about him. I'm interested to see how they progress his story in the future games. That being said, I wasn't expecting that they were going to do the origin bit of his story where he does get bitten by the spider and he does develop spider powers. So my question to you, Wes, is what do you think Miles getting his powers and revealing them to Peter at the end, what does that mean for both Peter and Miles moving forward in a potential Spider-Man 2 and beyond?
So I thought a lot about it. I have these little fantasies of oh, what could happen, and oh, wouldn't it just be great if it's a Batman Robin type of mentorship, which would be cool. And I think that's sort of what obviously I think going forward, Pete's definitely going to train him to use his powers responsibly.
Yeah, and you definitely get that at parts during the main story where he's teaching him, square and teaching him how to fight, which is really cool.
The important part, the important factor of this was that before he was even binned, you could tell that this was a genuine and lifelong potential friendship. They connected. And they didn't just connect because they both had spider powers, oh, I'm Spider-Man. Oh, I'm Spider-Man too. No, they're they both have, they were both going through hardship and they're both going through these emotional issues, and somehow they're able to find each other. And I think it's beautiful. I was amazed by it.
So I'll tell you my take on it. And
okay.
When I realized that he was going to get bitten by the spider, when they kept focusing, I was like, why are they focusing on the spider? What's going to happen with the spider?
As soon as I saw the spider, I knew.
Right.
I
was focusing on other things. I must have been focusing on other things. But when they finally did the reveal, when I finally found out, okay, Miles is going to get his powers, it almost, to me, like, and I don't want this to take away from how emotional Peter's story was between Peter and Doc Ock and the Sinister Six, because all of that was incredibly well done, and I loved every little bit of it. But once they did the spider bite for Miles, I felt like this was a Miles Morales origin story, where I think eventually Peter's going to die. I think, whether it's the next game or the game after that, I think Peter's going to die. And I think Miles will be the playable character moving on. Now, whether or not that ends up happening is, speculation, but that would be really cool. I'd be interested to see.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the end road, because they've taken bits from every type of, like different universes and like they've taken all the best parts of it, and one of the best parts in the Ultimate Universe was the fact that Pete dies and Miles takes over this mantle, and you can't have the Miles Morales Spider-Man without that ultimate sacrifice of I think yes, I could see that Spider-Man dying. I don't think that'll just you get to play Miles Morales. I think hopefully that'll happen beforehand, maybe some DLC that comes out in the future for the first game.
I would just hate for him to be relegated to being a DLC character. Like, I feel with as much time as they invested in him throughout the story, that he eventually is going to play a prominent role in a future Spider-Man game.
Yeah, well, if I had my way, I think if they could do some DLC of it in this game, it would be him trying to learn how to use his powers. Maybe he even has like a prototype suit. Then you do a second game. All right, you play as Peter Parker Spider-Man, and you're gonna have Miles Morales Spider-Man missions. Kind of mixing it up together. And then maybe Peter Parker Spider-Man dies in the second game or the third game at the beginning or some point then. But then going forward, have like a Miles Morales Spider-Man game all its own.
Right.
And I think that would be amazing.
Well, and while we're talking about the potential for ideas in Spider-Man 2, let's go ahead and address the kind of final story beat of the first game, and that is Norman Osborn. Obviously, he's kind of this ever-present figure throughout the main story. He's a big part of why Otto becomes Dr. Octopus, but he's this very, not vanilla, but he's this very neutral party where he's just a bad guy and he's a mayor, he's kind of a dick. But at the end, it is revealed that Harry, his son, who we previously thought had been away in Europe undergoing treatment for some sort of degenerative disease that's he got from his mother, he's actually here in New York, and his Norman is working on finding a cure for him, and part of it involves what looks like, which I think is safe to assume, a symbiote.
Yeah, definitely. And I love the duality of the potential of what could happen.
Yeah. And I think going into that last section, I think we know, obviously Harry didn't play a huge role in this game. Norman didn't play a huge role in this game. The Green Goblin is so centric to Spider-Man as a hero that you knew going into the second one that there was going to be some sort of Green Goblin involvement.
Yeah. So
I think to take those expectations and kind of turn it on its head and include the symbiote, which a lot of people are excited for, is really cool. Shout out to Insomniac. Let's just go ahead and say it. Shout out to Insomniac, because they made a game that, one, assumed we already knew Spider-Man, his more obscure and more famous villains, and they took what we already knew and kind of turned it on its head. And I think the way that it ended with the symbiote being involved in Harry, it left this huge question mark moving forward of, well, is he going to be the Goblin, or is he going to be some sort of symbiotic
I think this was Insomniac sort of, because you see, at the end, you see the tank and you see Harry. Oh, he's going to be the Green Goblin. Oh, okay.
Right, and everything was green, you knew.
See the little tendril. That was, in my mind, in a playful way. It was Insomniac giving us the finger. Sort of you don't really know. Yeah. You don't really know, do you?
Yeah, I think
spend the next 2-3 years debating it.
Yeah, and I think we kind of can all assume, okay, the symbiote is going to be, it's such a huge part of Spider-Man. You've got to know that's got to be part of their plans moving forward. You know, and they didn't want to, I understand they didn't want to include it in this game because they didn't want to bog it down. So I would imagine it's safe to assume the next game will have a heavy dose of some symbiotes and maybe some venom.
Yeah, because the symbiote storyline and the Green Goblin storyline, they're their own things. They need room to breathe, so to speak. It wouldn't have worked meshing it in what is already a fantastic gripping plot line. Throwing that in there would have sort of maybe confused us and kind of left things.
So my question to you, Wesley, is who do you see being the main villains in Spider-Man 2, whatever that ends up being called?
All right, so if I could have my choice, not having seen the end, would be Mysterio.
Well, okay, but let's say knowing what we know about the story.
I definitely see Green Goblin coming out of this. I want to say, just because they're so, like, from this game, they're throwing us for a lot of loops. I don't see Venom being the main symbiotic villain. I'm hoping for Carnage.
That would be cool.
I'm hoping they throw Carnage because one of the backpacks you get is the Daily Bugle giving Peter Parker like a farewell card because he's going off to work for Octavius. So you look at all the signatures, you see Betty Brant, you see J. Jonah Jameson, Robbie,
you see Eddie Brock.
You see Eddie Brock, and there's no like the Eddie we know wouldn't have filled out a card like that for him. Like Peter, that chump, I ain't gonna sign this thing. No, but so this seems like maybe an okay version of Eddie Brock, but maybe come the second game, maybe things go bad for him. But I like this idea of, hey, maybe Eddie Brock can be an okay guy, and somehow Cletus Cassidy, who's the Carnage, somehow gets this Harry Osborn. Ooh, maybe they do trial testing on prisoners, you know, with the symbiote because they're trying to cure Harry. So
if you're listening, Brian Intihar, we got a good idea for the story for Spider-Man 2. I know you kind of already have something planned, but this is a pretty good idea.
Just throw my name in the credits. No big deal. You don't have to.
Yeah. I think Venom and Goblin are probably the safe bets. Which, if this game showed you anything, you can't make safe bets. You know, I think the Sinister Six might have been a safe bet, but I think how they played with it and they kind of modernized it with Mr. Negative was really cool. Do you think any of the villains we saw in this game, Otto, the Sinister Six, any of them make a return in Spider-Man 2 in a big way?
85% sure Otto's not coming back for the second one. He emotionally and physically, he took way too much. Because, you know, like at the end where he sort of alludes to like, oh, hey, you know, help me out here. That way I make sure your secret's safe. And Peter just like, you know, you do what you think is best. That definitely might keep him out of action for a game or two.
Yeah, no, but, I think he'll make. I don't think he'll make an appearance as Dr. Octopus. I think he'll be involved somehow in the story, especially with Norman being involved. I think they've established him as a big part of this world, so I'd be shocked to see that they completely drop him completely. But I think it's also safe to assume that none of the other heroes will be here in the second one.
I actually will. I pretty good bets on Shocker showing up. He's a good nuisance.
Yeah.
He's a good. I could see him being in like every game. And the more you throw down on him, the more he'll like upgrade his suit and like he will get angrier each game, and there'll be like some ultimatum. You know, that seemed like something they barely touched on, but they barely touched on it for a reason.
Yeah.
I feel like it could be like a recurring gag, if you will. Taskmaster challenges. I definitely see that making a return.
True. And that's kind of why I was like, I think I was talking more about the major villains because I kind of think it's safe to assume Taskmaster challenges will come back in some way. I think you'll have some sort of Black Cat involvement. It depends on how the DLC will shake out. But I think it's safe to assume those kind of B and C tier guys would come back. Give me fucking Kraven the Hunter, dude.
Kraven would be amazing, but I want to hunt Lizard in the sewer. You gotta have that. That's a good thing that you do in Spider-Man.
Yeah, it'd be reminiscent of the Killer Croc missions in Batman Arkham. That would be pretty cool if they did that.
Can we take a second to appreciate the fact that yes, they took a lot of this game is heavily influenced on the story, but one, I like this game better than any Arkham played. Not saying that the Arkham games are bad.
Yeah.
They're amazing. They're incredible.
Well,
but this just took the good stuff and it made it even better.
Yeah, I think I'm coming from a biased place because I grew up loving Spider-Man. I've always preferred Spider-Man to any of the DC characters. But yeah, it's definitely, obviously it drew heavy inspiration from the Arkham games, but I think it evolved and it iterated on them in ways that felt natural for Spider-Man. That's what I think sets it apart. I think you can't compare the two, even though you can compare the two. You can't compare the two because the way Arkham looks and feels and plays is appropriate to Batman. And the way Spider-Man looks and feels and plays is appropriate to Spider-Man. I think those two can be two totally different entities and they both work for whatever property they're trying to emulate.
You're right. Okay. So we're talking about ideal villains, but whether it's the DLC coming up or a second game, how would you feel about someone from the Marvel who's a hero?
You actually took the next question I had out of my mouth because I was going to ask you that.
You're telepathic, man.
Yeah, no, we have that connection, that brother connection. I think you're not going to get any Marvel involvement. You're not going to get any, X-Men or anything like that. Strictly because they've kind of established that this is definitely a story about Peter. It's definitely all about Peter. So I think it would kind of cheapen it if you did bring in an Avenger, or if you do get someone, it'll be like a Wolverine, someone who is not part of the MCU, so to speak, who is kind of his own thing. But I still don't think. I think now that you have the interaction between Peter and Miles, I don't think you introduce a third hero, quote unquote, to mess with that.
Here's a specific scenario that I want to throw your way, and tell me if you love it or hate it. All right.
Okay.
It's the brand new Spider-Man game. It's 4 years from now. And the opening sequence is a normal New York building, and the wall gets smashed in. You see Spider-Man doing his best, and he's wrangling an out-of-control Hulk. And that's the opening sequence. Maybe, you're not really teaming up with the Hulk, but I think that would be, like, if you don't, like, allude to it at all, and you just open the game like that, this game's going to be better than the first one.
Yeah, but I think that opens way more questions of, okay, now you're going to be looking for other heroes throughout. I think, like I said, I think it's going to cheapen the moments involving Peter, because you're going to look for the greater universe outside of, whereas this is more of a smaller, more intimate, personal story. As cool as that would be, but I think they could do something similar, but just have it be the Rhino instead.
Or Juggernaut. That'd be a cool villain.
I was thinking Juggernaut too, but once again, it would open up a can of worms of, I would be playing that game the entire time being like, all right, well, when's so-and-so going to show up? When's Wolverine going to show up? When's Captain America going to show up? And
got plenty of, we got 3 DLCs lined up. I'm assuming Black Cat is definitely the next one.
Mm-hmm.
The one Silver Lining, I feel like that's going to be Silver Sable. I think that's a continuation of her story.
Yeah, and I honestly don't think they're going to introduce anybody new in the character in the DLCs. You might introduce one or two, but I don't think you're going to drop a huge villain in any of these, because that's what you say for your big releases.
True. If you had to introduce anybody, hero, villain, just for a quick DLC thing, who would you want?
Moon Knight, just because he's obscure enough.
I was gonna say not as obscure, but sort of the same personality. I would say Daredevil, just because you're dealing with Wilson Fisk. Wouldn't be too much of a stretch to, like, oh hey, we need to like maybe Fisk breaks out and we gotta put him in tonight, you know.
That or Craven. I think Craven the Hunter is one of those. He's like, if I'm introducing somebody new, like he's D-list. He's, you know, nobody really. He's not gonna headline any Spider-Man sequel. You're like, oh, the main bad guy is Craven. No, I mean, if they do a DLC with Craven, like, I think that'd be fun. I think it'd be awesome to see him kind of modernized. I like what they did. Shout out to Insomniac again. I like what they did with modernizing the suits, but keeping them really classic. Like Scorpion looked like Scorpion. He, you know, he didn't look goofy. He, you know, they kept it realistic, but also similar to what he looked like in the comics. And same for Vulture and Electro and Shocker in them. So I
didn't like Shocker. I'm sorry.
Really?
And I think so. What I think it is, I think it's just the costume itself. It's the only costume of all of Spider-Man's villains that just, even looking back on it now, because like all like the Vulture, they all look goofy because but Shocker was especially goofy.
Yeah.
Like, and just, you know, even when they modernize it, I just still see it. I'm like, nah, this why would you have that yellow cross stitch?
See, but I think they did, like, considering that, yes, his costume is goofy, his costume is stupid looking. I think they did a great job making it look modern, but having that throwback built into his suit.
Well, that's true. I also read, and I didn't notice this, but so like Electro, because you know he has like the thunderbolt sticking out of his face mask. So they're like, well, we wanted to include that. So what if his face had like electricity scars from when he got shocked initially, but they were in that shape?
That's pretty cool.
Played through it again. I'm like, oh, I totally noticed it. It looks just like that. I'm like,
yeah, I didn't even notice that at all. That's pretty cool. Yeah, that's I mean, like, and like I said, it just goes back to them modernizing it and making it look cool, still making it look like it's a comic book, but still modernizing it, making it look less stupid. And
you want to talk about a modern suit? That Spider-Man suit, both at the beginning and at the end, iconic. They will be iconic. It will be maybe not the anti-ox suit, but definitely the white with the white.
Yeah, the white spider is my favorite. Like, I constantly, like, when the video review for Spider-Man comes out, you will see a heavy dose of footage with the white spider costume because I loved it so much. That, and of course the classic. You can't beat the classic. But yeah, I really like the anti-ox suit. Was that an original design?
I want to say it because the anti-ox suit is just the white spider, just with the yellow spider.
Well, I just didn't know if that was something from the comics where he makes the anti-ox suit as a. Not
that I'm aware of. The only thing I can think of, and I don't even think they included it. Hang on, I'm coming up with a blank.
No, shout out to Insomniac again. I mean, like, really good original suits.
Yeah.
Well, Wes, I think we've touched on just about everything. The last main thing I guess we haven't really touched on, which I kind of had a hard time squeezing it in, was the fact that Aunt May died. Like, that was, like, we talk about it being an emotional and a personal story, and that plays a huge role into it. But there was just so much else going on around that time. But yeah, it was incredible. What did you think? Before we go, what did you think about the May dying? How they handled it?
In the comics, I want to say Aunt May has died one time, and that's how important Aunt May is to, like, not just Spider-Man, but just like Marvel. You know, because superheroes, supervillains, they die all the time now. So, you know, like Wolverine just died. You know, but so the fact that Insomniac had the audacity to
the
do
balls,
this.
You can say it.
The balls. They had big balls doing this. But you know what? It was emotional. It was heartbreaking. I felt everything Peter was feeling when he grabs the serum and he's just like so close, and he's just, but you don't hear it, but you hear it. You hear what Uncle Ben said to him time and time again about, with great power comes great responsibility. You hear all the lessons Aunt May's, just all in that moment, and you just see him just in defeat, because Aunt May, you know, wasn't defeated by Doc Ock or the Devil's Breath. It was the good in their heart that just sort of like, we have to do this, you know?
Yeah.
You know,
shout out to Yuri Lowenthal for that scene with May, and the scene with Dr. Octavius beforehand, where like you could really feel the pain that Peter was feeling, that this person, my confidant that I trusted you, became not only an enemy of mine, but killed my mother for all intents and purposes. And then obviously him going through losing May was super emotional. And
it was a victory. It was a victory that after she died, it really didn't feel like that until you see, people getting the cure. But like just that moment, it's like I didn't really win.
Yeah, but, I mean, and we already talked about how Insomniac didn't go through the established story of, here's his origin, here's how he got his powers, here's how Uncle Ben died. It kind of assumed we already knew that. And because of that, it was able to afford a little bit more creative control over the universe and to be able to experiment and toy around with different ideas. And I think for the most part, I can't really think of anything that didn't work, but for the most part, everything worked. And everything was believable, everything felt real, everything felt like it made sense within that world. So all in all, a fantastic, terrific story with emotional payoff. Wes, before we go, do you have anything else that you want to touch on in terms of Spider-Man, the gameplay, the story, the suits, anything like that?
Great array of suits. I mean, there's always that one other suit that you've seen somewhere that, so this game absolutely was a fan service. And of course you got DLC coming out of the wazoo, and there's going to have like 2-3 suits with each new DLC.
Give me more suits, man.
They're already like there's people already tweeting about like, oh man, why wasn't this suit in here?
Yeah.
The classic after he gets rid of the symbiote suit, he has the Fantastic Four jumper with the paper bag over his head.
Yeah.
Dumb. But it's been in so many different incarnations of it. I don't doubt that they'll have that in there at some point.
Yeah, give me and the black suit Spider-Man was an intentional exclusion from the game. So you imagine that will be making an appearance in the second one. But yeah, I agree. Great suits. Spider-Man. Shout out to Spider-Man 2099, the best suit hands down.
Your favorite, O'Hara, man.
Yeah, always. But that being said, ladies and gentlemen, it has been a pleasure talking to you, Wesley. And it's been a pleasure having you guys join in with us. We appreciate you guys watching us, listening to us, however you choose to consume it. Once again, you can find Red Tooth Games on Facebook at facebook.com/RedToothGames, on Twitter at RedToothGames, and on YouTube, and then also on the internet at redtoothgames.com. Give us a like, give us a share, tell your friends about us. Every little bit helps.
It's safe to say that we're all over the web.
Yeah, no, you'll get a web pun in the video review. Speaking of which, the Spider-Man video review will be coming out soon. I tried a different format this time. It is titled 5 Things You Should Know About Spider-Man, so be on the lookout for that. Once again, thank you guys for watching and have a great evening.